The first thing we were taught about Deathworld species was to fear them. Not openly, of course. The Academy does not permit irrational bias. It calls it informed caution. But as I took my seat beneath the towering hollow archives of the Hall of Species Evaluation, I could feel it, woven into the silence, humming beneath the sterile air like a suppressed alarm. Every cadet in that chamber felt it. The lights dimmed without warning. A vast projection ignited above us. Stretching from one end of the hall to the other, a rotating sphere of fractured terrain, oceans churning violently, continents scarred with storm systems and tectonic upheaval. Category 12. Deathworld, the lecturer began, voice precise, unfeeling. Environmental volatility extreme. Survival probability for most known species negligible. A ripple of unease passed through the room. I shifted slightly, adjusting my sensory receptors to filter the overwhelming data stream. Around me, cadets from a dozen systems leaned forward, some in curiosity, most in quiet dread. We had studied Deathworlds before, but never one like this. The projection shifted. Now came the traits. Each one appeared in sharp, clinical script, followed by footage. Extreme adaptability. The hollow flickered. A creature, small, fragile-looking, dragged itself across frozen terrain, its limbs trembling, its breath visible in the sub-zero air. The environment shifted abruptly. Heat, then flood, then drought. The creature endured all of it. High pain tolerance. The next sequence was worse. A being, injured, bleeding, continued moving, functioning, surviving, despite what should have been terminal damage. Its expression twisted, not in surrender, but in defiance. Rapid emotional fluctuation, a montage of faces, grief, rage, laughter, despair, hope, all within moments. No stability, no equilibrium. Self-sacrificial tendencies. The hall fell quieter. The footage showed multiple instances, beings rushing into danger zones, shielding others, choosing certain harm over personal safety. The data markers confirmed it. Statistically irrational behavior. To us, it was incomprehensible. To them, it was instinct. The lecturer allowed the final image to linger. A figure standing against overwhelming odds, unmoving despite the certainty of failure. Then, calmly. These traits indicate instability. The words settled like weight. Deathworld. Species exhibit behaviors that defy logical survival patterns. They endure conditions that should result in extinction. They persist where probability dictates collapse, a pause. They are not predictable. The projection shifted again. A new designation appeared. Species. Human. I felt it immediately, the tension sharpening, condensing into something almost tangible. Around me, several cadets adjusted their posture, some withdrawing slightly as if proximity alone carried risk. The image that followed was underwhelming. A human, physically unimposing, no visible natural weaponry, no reinforced exoskeleton, no adaptive camouflage, soft tissue, fragile frame. This was the species. This organism originates from a Category 12 Deathworld designated Earth, the lecturer continued. Despite its apparent physical limitations, it demonstrates survival metrics exceeding all projected thresholds. The footage resumed. Toxins entering the body, yet survival. Structural injuries, yet recovery. Isolation, yet psychological persistence. The data scrolled faster now, almost aggressively. War, disaster, collapse, reconstruction, again and again and again. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. I felt it too, the dissonance. Nothing aligned. The visuals contradicted every model we had ever been taught. How? Someone whispered behind me. The lecturer did not respond. Instead, the final set of traits appeared, larger this time, almost emphasized. Adaptability, resilience. emotional. Volatility, self-sacrifice. These characteristics, the lecturer said, voice lowering slightly, are not signs of evolutionary refinement, a pause. They are indicators of instability, the word echoed. Humans do not operate within acceptable behavioral parameters. They endure beyond reason. They act against self-preservation. They form attachments that override logic. Another pause. They are not safe. Silence followed. Not the quiet of understanding, but the quiet of something unsettled, something unresolved. I found myself staring at the human figure still frozen in the projection. It did not look dangerous. It did not look like anything at all. And yet, the data did not lie. They should not exist. The lecturer added softly. That was when it happened. A small movement, barely noticeable at first. One of the cadets, seated, several rows ahead, raised a hand. The gesture itself was not unusual. What was unusual was who it belonged to. The human. I felt a shift ripple through the hall as others noticed. Sensory tendrils adjusted, visual focus recalibrated. Every gaze turned toward her. She had been silent until now. Still, observing. The lecturer paused, clearly unprepared for the interruption. "You may speak," they said, though there was hesitation in their tone. The human stood, slowly, deliberately. There was no aggression in her posture, no visible tension. But something about the way she moved, it drew attention, commanded it. Without effort, her gaze swept across the chamber. Not defensive, not uncertain. Certain. "Stop," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed harder than any command. The lecturer stiffened. "Clarify your interruption, cadet." The human tilted her head slightly as if considering how to respond. Then she spoke again. "You're wrong. Ripple of shock surged through the room. No one challenged academy doctrine. No one. The lecturer's tone sharpened. "Your statement requires justification." The human nodded once. Then she looked up, directly at the towering list of Deathworld traits still hovering above us. Adaptability, resilience, pain, tolerance, emotional instability, self-sacrifice. For a moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, something shifted. Not in the data, not in the lecture, in us. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, too calm. "You're not describing a Deathworld species." A pause. Every sensor in the room locked onto her, every mind waiting. Her next words did not rise. They did not need to. "You're describing my childhood." And just like that, the entire chamber fell into a silence so absolute. It felt like the void itself had opened beneath us. Because in that moment, for the first time, the data stopped being theoretical and became something far more dangerous, personal. Silence, in the academy, is never empty. It carries calculation, judgment, correction. But what followed the human's words was none of those things. It was hesitation. The lecturer did not respond immediately. Their upper limbs remained perfectly still, but the subtle flicker of their ocular membranes betrayed something rare, uncertainty. Around me, cadets shifted uneasily. Data streams blinked inactive. No one recorded, no one spoke, because no one knew what came next. The human, however, did not seem concerned. She remained standing, posture relaxed, as if she had not just fractured the foundation of the lecture. The lecturer finally exhaled, a controlled release of pressure. "Cadet," they began, voice regaining its clinical edge. "Your statement contradicts verified galactic data. Clarify your claim." The human nodded once. Not submissive, not defiant. Certain. "You're analyzing those traits like they're abnormalities," she said. "Like something went wrong." Her eyes moved across the chamber, meeting ours, one by one. But nothing went wrong. A ripple of discomfort spread. The lecturer gestured toward the projection. Extreme environmental instability is not a neutral condition. It is a limiting factor for evolutionary development. The human glanced up at the rotating image of Earth. Storm systems tearing across oceans. Lightning fracturing the sky. Land masses shifting under pressure. She studied it for a moment. Then she gave a small, almost amused breath. "That?" she said. "That's just weather." The reaction was immediate: confusion, alarm, disbelief. The lecturer's voice sharpened. "Clarify. The data indicates recurring environmental catastrophes." "Yeah," she interrupted gently. "Storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps." She shrugged. "We grow up with those." A murmur spread through the hall, louder this time, less controlled. I felt my internal processors struggle to reconcile the statement. Grow up with those? Such conditions were classified as extinction-level threats. The human continued as if explaining something obvious to a child. You learn patterns. You adapt. You prepare when you can. And when you can't, she paused. You deal with it anyway. The lecturer stepped forward slightly, their composure tightening. Adaptation, at that scale, should not be sustainable across generations. The human tilted her head. And yet, she said softly, we're still here. The words landed heavier than before, because they were no longer abstract. They were evidence. The projection shifted again, almost defensively, pulling up the next category. High pain tolerance, the lecturer stated, as if reclaiming control. Human subjects demonstrate continued functionality despite severe physical trauma. The footage resumed. Injuries, fractures, blood loss. I felt my sensory field narrow involuntarily. The human watched it without flinching. Yeah, she said. Just that. No elaboration. The lecturer pressed. This level of pain endurance is considered abnormal. Most species experience shutdown responses under similar conditions. The human's gaze dropped slightly, as if searching through memory. When I was younger, she began, voice quieter now, I broke my arm. The room stilled again. It hurt, she admitted. A lot. A pause. But we were far from any medical center, so we improvised. My internal systems flagged the word. Improvised? She continued. My neighbor helped set it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. A flicker of something crossed her expression. Not pain. Familiarity. I didn't stop, she added. The lecturer's tone sharpened further. You continued activity despite structural damage to your limb? She looked at them, confused. What was I supposed to do? She asked. The question hung in the air. Not rhetorical, genuine, and that made it worse. The lecturer hesitated again. Because there was no logical answer, the projection advanced almost urgently now. Rapid emotional fluctuation, the lecturer stated. Human psychological profiles indicate unstable emotional states, extreme variance within short durations. The hollow filled with faces again, grief, anger, laughter, despair. The human studied them. Then she shook her head slightly. That's not instability, she said. Her voice had changed. Not defensive, not corrective, certain. That's being alive. The room tightened. You feel things, she continued. Sometimes all at once, sometimes too much. But that doesn't make you broken. Her gaze swept across us again. It means you're paying attention. I felt something shift inside. My cognition, an unfamiliar distortion. We were taught to regulate, to stabilize, to eliminate extremes, but she spoke of them as necessary. The lecturer attempted to interrupt. Emotional regulation is essential for what? She asked gently. The lecturer paused. For optimal decision-making, they replied. The human considered that, then nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. Sometimes. a subtle emphasis. Other times, she continued, you don't have time to calculate. You just act. The final category appeared, self-sacrificial tendencies. The hall seemed to dim around it. The lecturer spoke carefully now. Human subjects frequently engage in behaviors that prioritize others over self-preservation. This is statistically irrational. The human exhaled softly. Yeah, she said again. The repetition was unsettling. You keep saying that like it's a flaw, she added. It is, the lecturer replied immediately. It contradicts fundamental survival logic. The human looked at them for a long moment. Then she asked, whose survival? The question cut deeper than anything before. No one answered, because we had never considered it. She took a small step forward, not aggressive, but grounding. If you're alone, she said, then yeah, maybe it doesn't make sense. Her gaze shifted toward us. But we're not. A pause. Not really. The room felt different now. Not tense. Unstable. The lecturer straightened, clearly attempting to regain authority. Statistical models indicate that human survival rates in extreme conditions fall below acceptable thresholds, yet your species persists. They turned slightly, gesturing toward the data. Explain that. For the first time, the human hesitated. Not out of uncertainty, but as if searching for the simplest way to explain something too large. Finally, she spoke. We don't think about odds, she said. The lecturer's tone sharpened. That is precisely the issue. When survival is the only option, she continued, voice steady, there are no odds. Silence, no projection, no data. Just that sentence. It settled into the chamber like gravity. I felt it pressing against my thoughts, warping them. Because our entire understanding of existence was built on probability, on prediction, on minimizing risk. But she was describing something else entirely, a state where calculation ceased, where survival was not a variable, but a command. Around me the murmurs returned, but softer now, uncertain, not questioning her, questioning everything. Else the lecturer did not speak, for the first time since the lecture began. They had no immediate response, and in that silence, the realization began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle. We had been analyzing humans as anomalies, outliers, errors in the system. But what if they were not surviving because they were strong? The thought emerged slowly, reluctantly. What if they were strong because survival had never been optional? I felt a cold ripple pass through my neural pathways because that possibility was far more terrifying than anything the data had shown. And as I looked at the human cadet standing there, calm, steady, unshaken, I understood something I had not before. We were not observing a species that had adapted to hardship. We were observing a species that had been shaped by it, forged by it, defined by it. And the most unsettling part? She spoke of it as if it were normal. The lecturer finally moved, their voice quieter now. Cadet, they began, but they stopped, because there was nothing left to say. The framework was breaking, and for the first time, we did not know how to rebuild it. The human remained standing, waiting, watching, as if she knew. This was only the beginning. Curiosity is not a comfortable sensation for our kind. It is controlled, measured, contained within acceptable boundaries of inquiry. But what filled the Hall of Species evaluation in that moment was not controlled curiosity. It was something else, something sharper, something dangerous. The lecturer stood motionless for several cycles, their form rigid beneath the dimmed light of inactive projections. The human's words still lingered, echoing in the silence like a fracture spreading through glass. Then, without warning, the hall shifted. Archive access granted. the lecturer said quietly. The hollow archives ignited again, this time, not with isolated data points, but with something far more volatile. Displaying historical record. Earth. The air itself seemed to tighten. I felt my sensory systems heighten involuntarily as the first image appeared. A city. Dense. Complex. Alive. And then, gone. The explosion tore through it with incomprehensible force, a blinding surge of light followed by a rising column of destruction. Structures collapsed inward, vaporized, erased within seconds. Collective recoil rippled through the cadets. "What was that?" someone whispered. "War," the lecturer replied. The word felt insufficient. The footage did not pause. It accelerated. Continents scarred by conflict, endless lines of figures moving across shattered landscapes, weapons, primitive by galactic standards, yet devastating in their scale. The humans stood silently as we watched. No interruption, no defense, only observation. "Casualty estimates?" another cadet asked, voice unsteady. The answer came cold. "Unquantifiable across recorded history." The next sequence began before we could process it. Water. Too much of it. A city submerged beneath relentless waves, structures crumbling as currents swallowed everything. Figures struggling, some escaping, others not. Environmental catastrophe, the lecturer stated. Then fire. Vast stretches of land consumed by it. Forests reduced to ash. Skies choked with smoke so thick it obscured the sun itself. Then, disease. Microscopic, invisible, and unstoppable. Populations collapsing not from force, but from within. Then famine. Then drought. Then collapse. Again, and again, and again. Each time the pattern repeated. Destruction, loss, silence, and then movement, rebuilding. The footage slowed. We saw it clearly now. Where cities had fallen, new ones rose. Where systems had failed, new structures formed. Where populations had been reduced, growth returned. Not identical, not restored, evolved. "How is this possible?" I heard myself ask, though I had not intended to speak. The lecturer did not answer, because they did not know. The human did. "She doesn't look proud," another cadet whispered, behind me. I focused on her. She was watching the footage, yes, but not with pride, not with shame either. Something else. Recognition. "You expected us to disappear," she said softly. The room stilled again. No one denied it. Because it was true. Every model, every projection, every predictive system we had relied upon pointed to the same conclusion. A species subjected to this level of repeated catastrophe should not endure. "And we almost did," she added. That drew attention. The lecturer turned slightly. "Clarify." The human's gaze remained fixed on the projection. "There were times," she said, "when we got close." The footage shifted. A darker sequence. Global systems failing simultaneously. Conflict overlapping with environmental collapse, panic, disorder, fragmentation. For a moment, it looked like the end. "How did you recover?" a cadet asked, unable to contain the question. The human exhaled slowly. "We didn't," she said. Confusion surged. "That doesn't align with—" "We didn't recover," she repeated, turning now to face us. Not completely, not cleanly. A pause. We adapted. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. The projection responded, shifting to show innovation, tools emerging from necessity, weapons repurposed into infrastructure. Technology advancing, not in comfort, but under pressure. "They learned through destruction," the lecturer murmured, almost to themselves. The human shook her head slightly. We learned through surviving it. The difference was unsettling. The footage continued, communities forming in the aftermath of collapse. Individuals helping one another despite scarcity. Systems rebuilding, not perfectly, but enough. You cooperate, I said, the realization forming as I spoke it. Sometimes, she replied. The single word carried weight. The projection shifted again. Conflict, humans against humans. Destruction not from environment, but from themselves. The contradiction was immediate. You also destroy yourselves, another cadet observed. Sometimes, she said again. No denial, no justification, just truth. The lecturer stepped forward slightly. Your species exhibits simultaneous tendencies toward cooperation and self-destruction. This duality should result in systemic instability. The human considered that, then gave a small nod. Yeah, she said. The simplicity of it was disarming. But it doesn't, the lecturer pressed. Another pause. The human looked back at the projection, at the endless cycle, destruction, survival, rebuilding. Then she spoke. It does, she said quietly. The room stilled. We're not stable, she continued. We never have been. Her gaze shifted again, meeting ours. But we don't stop. The words settled heavily, because we were beginning to see it, not as data, not as anomaly, as pattern. A cycle not of failure, but of persistence. The footage slowed once more. Now it focused on individuals, a figure pulling another from debris, a group sharing limited resources, a single person standing when others could not. Acts small in scale, but repeated, endlessly. Why? Someone asked. The question echoed. Why continue? Why rebuild? Why endure? The human did not answer immediately. For the first time, her expression shifted. Something deeper, something harder to define. Because someone has to, she said. The words were simple, but they carried something vast behind them. The projection dimmed slightly, transitioning to its final sequence. A city, not untouched, not perfect, rebuilt. Structures new but uneven, systems functional but evolving. Life continuing. And then, a child, running, laughing. The sound, though simulated, felt foreign in the chamber. Light, unburdened, alive. The contrast was overwhelming. After everything we had seen, after destruction on a scale beyond comprehension, there it was. Not survival, not endurance, life, unbroken. I felt something shift again inside my cognition. Not fear, not entirely, something else. Understanding, incomplete, but forming. The lecturer remained silent. For once, they did not attempt to summarize, because there was no framework left to contain what we had witnessed. Finally, a voice broke through, quiet, uncertain. Why didn't your species collapse? The question no one had dared ask. Until now. The human turned toward the speaker. Then she looked back at the projection, at the child, still laughing in the reconstructed city. For a moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, I realized something. She was not searching for an answer. She already had it. She was deciding how to say it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Because someone always gets back up. The words settled into the chamber with a weight that no data could replicate. Because we had seen it, over and over, across time, across catastrophe. Someone always stood again, not because they were unbroken, but because they refused to remain broken. The projection faded, the hall dimmed, and for the first time since the lecture began, no one felt the need to speak. Because the fear we had entered with was no longer the same. It had changed, evolved. We were still afraid, but now we understood why. And that made it far more dangerous, because fear of the unknown can be contained, categorized, managed. But fear of something understood, something proven, something that endures beyond logic, that is something else entirely. I looked at the human again. She had not moved, still standing, still calm, as if everything we had just witnessed was simply history. And in that moment, I realized the most unsettling truth of all. That was not the end of their story. That was just what they had already survived. And if that was their past, then what exactly? Were they capable of becoming next? Understanding, we had been taught, leads to stability, predictability, control. But what settled over the hall of species evaluation after the final archive faded was none of those things. It was tension, thick, expanding, uncontainable, because understanding the humans had not made them less frightening. It had made them worse. The lecturer did not resume the lesson. Instead, they activated something far more serious. Escalation protocol, they said quietly. The words alone were enough to send a ripple through the chamber. Several cadets straightened instantly. Others withdrew, instinctively creating distance, not from the lecturer, but from the human. The air shimmered as multiple remote presences materialized. Faculty, analysts, overseers. Their forms flickered into existence above the central platform, larger than life, their features obscured by layers of authority and distance. Observers, not teachers, that was the first shift. What is the nature of this escalation? One of the projections asked, voice layered with overlapping harmonics. The lecturer did not hesitate. Subject, human species classification. Current assessment frameworks insufficient. A pause. Requesting re-evaluation. The projections processed this. Then, proceed. The hall dimmed further, isolating the human at the center of the chamber. Whether intentionally or not, I could not determine. Data streams reignited, faster now, sharper. Not educational. Analytical, cold. Behavioral unpredictability exceeds acceptable thresholds, one observer stated. Psychological resilience indicates resistance to conventional deterrence, another added. Historical data confirms repeated survival beyond projected extinction points. The words stacked upon each other, building something heavy, something final. Conclusion, a third voice intoned. Species presents potential destabilization risk to galactic systems. The phrase echoed. Destabilization risk. I felt it land. Not just in my cognition, but across the entire chamber, because we all understood what it meant. Not curiosity, not study, containment. The word had not yet been spoken, but it was there, waiting. Recommend classification update. Another observer continued. High-risk designation. Monitoring protocols required. Potential preemptive measures should be considered. A different voice added. The hall grew colder. What had begun as a lecture was no longer a lesson. It was a judgment. I found myself looking at the human again. She had not moved, not once, not during the escalation, not during the analysis. She stood exactly as before, calm, steady, listening as her species was reduced. Not to individuals, but to a problem. Human behavioral patterns indicate willingness to act against self-interest for collective gain, one observer noted. This creates unpredictability in conflict scenarios. Emotional variance further complicates predictive modeling. High adaptability increases long-term threat potential. The cadence of their voices was precise, detached, as if they were not speaking about living beings, as if they were discussing a variable in an equation. The lecturer remained silent now, no longer leading, only observing. Like the rest of us. Containment strategies. One of the projections began. Stop. The word cut through everything. Not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Every projection froze. Every data stream halted. Every mind in the chamber locked onto the source. The human. She had not raised her voice. She had not changed her stance. But something had shifted. Not in her. In the room. "You think we're dangerous?" she said. No accusation, no anger, just a statement. The observers did not respond immediately. Perhaps they were not accustomed to being interrupted. Perhaps they were recalibrating. It did not matter, she continued. But you're only looking at half the picture. A pause. "Clarify," one of the projections said, tone sharpening. The human nodded slightly. Then, for the first time since she had spoken, she stepped forward, not toward them, but into the center of the chamber, into the space where the data had been, where the judgment now hovered. "You've seen what we survive," she said. Her voice was steady, grounded. "But you haven't seen why." The projection flickered, then, unexpectedly, shifted. Not at the command of the lecturer, not from the observers, but from her. A new sequence began. Not war, not destruction. Something else, a figure, human, running into a collapsing structure, not to escape, to reach someone trapped inside. Another scene, a battlefield, two opposing sides, one human carrying another, not an ally, an enemy, wounded, helpless. A third, a disaster zone, resources scarce, yet shared, given freely, even when it meant having less. I felt something tighten in my cognition. This was not survival, not directly. This was choice. "They do this repeatedly," one observer noted, confusion threading through their tone. "Yes," the human said, "they risk loss of life for unrelated individuals. Yes, this behavior reduces individual survival probability." Yeah, the simplicity of her responses was disarming because she was not denying it, not explaining it away, just acknowledging it. "Why?" another observer demanded. The question was sharper now, less analytical, more urgent. The human watched the projection for a moment longer. Then she answered, "Because they matter." The words landed strangely, vague, imprecise, and yet heavy. "Define." "Matter," one observer pressed. The human gave a small, almost tired breath. "I can't," she said, a pause. "Not in a way you'd accept." The chamber fell silent again. But this silence was different. Not confusion, not fear. Something shifting. She turned slightly, looking not at the observers, but at us, the cadets. "You think we're unstable?" she said. No one interrupted. "You think we don't follow logic?" Still no response. She nodded. "You're not wrong." A flicker of tension. "But you're not right either." The contradiction hung in the air. "We can be terrifying," she continued, and now, for the first time, there was something in her voice. Not pride, not shame, truth. "You saw it," she said. "The wars, the destruction, the things we do to survive." A pause. "We don't always get it right." The projection flickered again, brief flashes of chaos, conflict, failure. Then, it steadied, returning to those quieter moments. Helping hands, shared burdens, rebuilding. But that's not all we are. Her gaze lifted, meeting the projections directly now. "You're analyzing us like we're a threat." Another pause. "Like we're something that needs to be controlled." The word lingered, unspoken before, now undeniable. She took another. "Step forward, closer to the center, closer to the judgment." "Yes," she said softly, "we can be dangerous." The admission was immediate, unfiltered, and that made it impossible to dismiss. "But we can also be the ones who stay," her voice lowered slightly, "not weaker, heavier, when everything else falls apart." The words settled into the chamber, like gravity, because we had seen it, in the footage, in the patterns, in the history. Destruction, yes, but also presence, endurance, support. When logic said retreat, they stayed. When probability said failure, they continued. When survival said save yourself, they chose otherwise. The projections flickered, not with data, with hesitation. For the first time since they had appeared, they were uncertain. I felt it ripple through the hall, through every cadet, through every system that had once felt stable, because the equation no longer balanced. Humans were dangerous. That much was true. But they were also something else. Something the models could not quantify. Something that did not fit into threat assessments or containment protocols. Something necessary. The lecturer finally spoke, their voice quieter than before. This duality, they began, then stopped, because there was no word for it, no classification, no category. The human did not fill the silence. She simply stood there, waiting, as if she had said everything that needed to be said, and slowly, the tension began to fracture, not disappear, not resolve, but crack. Because the fear remained, it had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened. But now, it was no longer alone. It was accompanied by something else. Recognition, respect, uncertainty, and perhaps, for the first time, doubt. Not about the humans, but about ourselves, our frameworks, our assumptions, our understanding of what it meant to survive. I looked around the chamber. No one spoke. No one moved. Because we all felt it. The shift, irreversible, and in that moment, one realization became impossible to ignore. If a species like this could exist, unpredictable, unbreakable, capable of both destruction and compassion in equal measure, then the question was no longer whether they were dangerous. The question was, what happens when something like that is pushed too far? There is a moment, before failure, when everything still feels controlled, measured, recoverable. We were in that moment. And then, the alarms began. Not gradual, not escalating, instant. A piercing, system-wide alert that tore through the chamber with violent urgency. The lights snapped from dimmed lecture mode to emergency crimson. The air shifted, pressure dropping just enough to trigger instinct. Simulation protocol initiated, the Academy system announced. But the voice was almost drowned beneath the chaos. Hull integrity compromised. Oxygen levels decreasing. Structural failure imminent. The hollow archives vanished, replaced by a cascading flood of emergency data. Sections of the chamber flickered, walls fracturing, seams splitting, atmosphere venting into the void beyond. It looked real. It felt real. And for many of us, it was real. Cadets moved immediately. Protocol activated faster than thought. I felt it surge through my system, training overriding hesitation. Preserve self, locate nearest exit, maintain structural pathways, do not deviate. Around me, bodies moved with precision. No panic, only calculated urgency. Each cadet followed the hierarchy of survival exactly as we had been taught. Some assisted those within immediate proximity, but only within acceptable risk thresholds, always within limits, always controlled. That was survival. That was logic. That was correct. And then, there was the human. She did not move toward. The exit. She moved the opposite direction. At-risk zones detected, the system warned. Do not approach compromised sectors. She didn't slow. Cadet! The lecturer's voice cut through the chaos. Maintain protocol! She ignored it, not out of defiance, out of something else. I watched, frozen for a fraction too long, as she crossed into a section of the chamber where the structural integrity had already dropped below survivable thresholds. A cadet, one of the smaller aquatic species, was trapped beneath a collapsed support frame, their mobility impaired, their respiration system faltering as oxygen levels dropped. They would not make it. The system had already marked them, non-recoverable. The human reached them anyway. "Don't move," she said, calm, steady, as if the world were not tearing itself apart around her. She braced herself against the fractured structure. The support beam shifted slightly, then held. Impossible. Her muscles strained, visible even through her fragile-looking frame. The structure groaned under pressure. "You will cause further collapse," the system warned. She didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted her grip, lifted, just enough. The trapped cadet pulled free, disoriented but alive. "Go," she said, already turning away. No confirmation, no pause, just movement, toward the next failure point. I felt something fracture in my logic. This was not survival behavior. This was something else. "Warning! Oxygen levels critical," the system announced. Sections of the chamber sealed automatically, cutting off compromised areas, containing loss, standard procedure. The human was on the wrong side of that containment. She did not attempt to escape. She moved deeper. "Why?" I heard myself whisper. No one answered, because no one understood. Another collapse. This time, a group of cadets, pinned, disoriented, struggling to maintain function. The human dropped beside them. "Stay with me," she said. Her hands moved quickly, sealing fractures in their suits, stabilizing breathing systems, redistributing oxygen reserves, improvising, always improvising. "You are exceeding safe exposure limits," the system warned. Her response was a strained breath. "Yeah," she muttered, and kept going. The chamber shook. A violent tremor ripped through the structure, forcing even the most stable cadets to stagger. Catastrophic failure imminent. The words echoed like a countdown. This was the breaking point. This was where protocol dictated withdrawal, abandonment of non-viable zones, preservation of remaining assets. That was how survival worked. That was how it had always worked. The human disagreed. She forced open a sealed panel, sparks erupting as she manually accessed the failing systems beneath. "Unauthorized override detected," the system warned. She ignored it. Her hands moved faster now, despite visible injury, blood marking the edges of her movements. "Come on," she murmured under her breath, to the system, to herself, to everything. The panel flickered, then stabilized. A section of the chamber, previously marked lost, repressurized. Breath returned where there had been none. The system recalculated. Casualty projections adjusted. Lower. Not by much. But enough. I felt it. That shift. Small, but undeniable. She moved again. Always moving. Never stopping. Even as her movements slowed. Even as the damage accumulated. Even as logic screamed that she should not still be functioning. Another cadet. Fell. She caught them. Another system failed. She fixed it. Another collapse. She held it back just long enough. Time. That was what she was creating. Not safety, not certainty. Time. And with it, possibility. "Simulation parameters exceeded," the system announced. "Terminate," one of the observers began. "Wait," another voice interrupted. They were watching now. All of them. Not analyzing, not categorizing. Watching. Because something was happening that their models could not predict. The human stumbled, just once, a small misstep, but enough to show it. The exhaustion, the damage, the limit. She caught herself against a fractured surface, breathing harder now, slower. For a moment, it looked like she might stop, that the system would finally prove correct, that there was a limit. Then she pushed off and kept going. A low sound escaped me, not thought, not language, something else. Because I realized something in that moment. She was past survival, past logic, past reason, and she was still moving. The system recalculated again. Casualty projections. Dropping, dropping, dropping. It made no sense. It should not have been possible, and yet there it was. Real, measured, undeniable. End simulation. The command cut through everything. Instant. Absolute. The alarms stopped. The red lights faded. The chamber stabilized. The fractures vanished. The atmosphere returned to normal. Silence. Complete. Overwhelming. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Because we were all still there. Alive. All of us. I turned slowly, looking across the chamber. Every cadet, present, functioning, survived. That should not have been the outcome. Not even close. The human stood near the center of the room, breathing heavily, injured, exhausted, but standing. The lecturer stepped forward, their movements slower than before, uncertain. The results, they began, then stopped, because the data had already appeared. Projected above us. Cold, precise, final. Projected casualty rate without intervention, 72%. Actual casualty rate, 0.8%. A ripple moved through the chamber. Shock, disbelief, something deeper. The lecturer stared at the numbers as if they might change. They didn't. "Explain," one of the observers demanded. But there was no explanation, not one that fit, not one that made sense. The human straightened slightly, wincing as she did. She glanced at the projection, then at us, and then she shrugged, a small, almost dismissive motion. "That's normal," she said. The words echoed, soft, simple, impossible, because nothing about what we had just witnessed was normal. Not the actions, not the outcome. Not the fact that one individual had altered the fate of an entire system through sheer refusal to stop. The lecturer looked at her, truly looked. Not as a subject, not as a variable, but as something they could not define. "That behavior," they began slowly, "it is not sustainable." The human tilted her head slightly. "Maybe not," she said. A pause. "But it works." The simplicity of it was devastating, because the data agreed. I felt something settle into place within my understanding. Not comfort, not certainty, something heavier. Truth. We had feared humans because they were unpredictable, because they defied logic, because they survived what they should not. But that was not the most dangerous thing about them. The most dangerous thing was that when everything breaks, they don't. And as I stood there, surrounded by cadets who should have been lost, alive only because one human refused to follow the rules, I realized something that none of our models had ever accounted for. If this was what one human could do at their limit, then what would happen if they ever decided to go beyond it? After the simulation ended, no one moved for a long time, not because we were instructed to remain still, but because movement felt inappropriate, as if any action taken too soon might disturb something fragile that had just been revealed. The Hall of Species evaluation no longer felt like a lecture chamber, it felt like a threshold. Behind us was everything we thought we understood. Ahead of us, something we did not. The emergency systems had fully disengaged. The crimson glow was gone. The fractured illusion of catastrophe had been replaced with sterile calm once more, but nothing had returned to normal, because we had not returned to normal. The lecturer stood motionless at the center platform, their data interface still active, but untouched. Around them, faint, holographic remnants flickered, attempts to restore procedural order that no one acknowledged. Then, slowly, the first cadet approached the human. It was one of the insectoid analytical class, highly structured, cognition, emotionally regulated, predictable, or so we believed. They stopped a respectful distance away. "You are not aligned with statistical survival models," they said carefully. The human looked at them, still breathing heavily from the simulation, still marked by effort, but present. "I noticed," she replied. A pause. Not awkward, just real. Then another. Cadet approached. Then another, and another. It did not happen all at once. It spread, like recalibration. Not fear, now. Something else. Curiosity, respect, even hesitation that resembled admiration, though none of us would have labeled it that directly. The questions began softly. "Why did you assist when survival probability was negative?" The human blinked once. "Because someone needed help," she said. Another question followed immediately. "Why did you continue when your biological limits were exceeded?" She shrugged slightly. "Because stopping wasn't an option." That answer unsettled some of us. Not because it lacked logic, but because it didn't require it. A third question came, more hesitant. Why prioritize others over self-preservation? The human exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this one. "Because it's not either or," she said. A pause. "You take care of yourself, so you can take care of others." The insectoid tilted their head. "That is inefficient." The human gave a faint smile. "Yeah," she said, then added, "So is being alive sometimes?" Silence followed, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was reflective. The lecturer finally spoke, voice quieter than we had ever heard it. "Your behavioral framework does not conform to established survival optimization protocols." The human looked toward them. "Probably not," she agreed, a flicker of tension. "Then, what is the governing principle?" the lecturer asked. That question shifted the room again, because it was no longer about classification. It was about understanding. The human hesitated for the first time since the simulation ended, not in uncertainty, but in selection, choosing words that would fit something that did not translate easily. Finally, she said, "There isn't one." The simplicity of it struck harder than any data stream. The lecturer pressed gently. "There must be causation." The human shook her head. "Not always." A pause. "Sometimes you just keep going." The cadets exchanged looks. This was not a model we could compute easily. No optimization function, no predictive curve, just continuation. "Even under fear?" another cadet asked. The human nodded. "Yeah." "Even under pain?" Another nod. "Yeah." "Even under uncertainty?" Pause. Then, especially then, that answer lingered. Something about it refused to settle into our systems, because we were built on certainty thresholds, risk mitigation, controlled variables. But she was describing something that operated outside all of that. The lecturer turned, slightly toward the remaining projections. Slowly, the classification interface reactivated. But this time, no one rushed to fill it, because the old categories no longer fit comfortably. "Deathworld species," one observer began cautiously. Pause. Then correction. Appears insufficient. Another voice followed. Suggested revision. Hyper-adaptive survival class. Another correction. Still inaccurate. Silence. The human watched quietly as we dismantled our own definitions. Not with satisfaction, not with pride, just observation. Finally, one cadet spoke, voice uncertain. What are you then? The question hung in the air longer than any before it. The human looked at them, not surprised, not offended, just thoughtful. Then she said, "We're human." A pause. That's all. But that answer did not resolve anything. If anything, it deepened the uncertainty, because it explained nothing, and yet explained everything. The lecturer finally stepped forward, interface shifting rapidly as revisions cascaded across classification. Systems. Update proposal submitted, they announced. All eyes turned. The projection above us shifted. Old label, Category 12. Deathworld species. Human flicker, deletion pending. Replacement attempt. Failed. Another attempt. Failed again. The system hesitated, a rare occurrence. Then, a new designation appeared, not fully resolved, not fully agreed upon, but forming unclassified, adaptive sapient entity. A pause, then another revision began beneath it. But even that felt insufficient. The human watched it all quietly, then spoke softly, almost as an aside. "You don't have to figure us out right away." The lecturer turned toward her. She continued, "We've been around for a while. You'll get used to it." That line should have been simple, comforting even. But it wasn't. Because it implied endurance beyond observation, persistence beyond classification, survival beyond understanding. One cadet asked quietly, "Is that what strength is to your species?" The human considered the question, longer this time. Not because she didn't know, but because she was aware of how easily it could be misunderstood. Finally, she answered, "No." A pause. "Strength is what happens when you don't stop, even when everything tells you to." Silence followed. Then she added, softer, "Even when you want to." That landed differently, heavier, more personal. Because it removed the abstraction, it was no longer about species. It was about choice, moment by moment, again and again. The lecturer lowered their interface slightly. For the first time, the tone shifted away from analysis, toward acknowledgement. "Your framework of resilience is not dependent on environment alone," they said. The human nodded. "Right." A pause. "It's how we respond to it." That was it. No grand declaration, no cosmic truth, just a simple alignment of understanding, and somehow that made it more powerful. Around the chamber, cadets stood differently now. Not relaxed, not fully reassured, but changed. Because something fundamental had shifted. Humans were no longer an anomaly to be contained, or a threat to be managed, or an equation to be solved. They were something else. Something that persisted in spite of everything we understood about limits. The lecturer finally addressed the classification system again. "Final recommendation pending consensus," they said. But even they did not sound certain. The projection flickered, then stabilized. Not as a conclusion, but as an admission. Classification incomplete. The human turned slightly, preparing to leave the center space. But before she did, she looked back at us. Not as subjects, not as observers, but as participants in something now shared. "You'll figure it out," she said. A pause. "We're not going anywhere." And for the first time since this all began, that statement did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a promise, or perhaps worse, a fact. The hall remained silent long after she stopped speaking, because there was nothing left in the data stream that could properly respond. And somewhere deep in our collective cognition, we understood why. Because we had tried to define strength as resistance to failure. But what we had just witnessed was something else entirely. Strength that included failure and continued anyway. And that was not something the galaxy had prepared us for.
I still remember the first moment we called them dangerous. It feels distant now. Not because it wasn't true at the time, but because truth, like all things, changes shape when viewed from far enough away. The Academy records classify this period as Post-Integration Reassessment Cycle 4, but that title says nothing of what we experienced, nothing of what we became. I am writing this as a senior observer assigned to long-term behavioral synthesis of emerging sapient species interaction models. That is the formal designation, but it is not the honest one, because what we observed was not a model, it was a transformation. It began with fear. It always does. Fear is efficient that way. It arrives first and it demands certainty. Humans provided none. Instead, they gave us contradiction. The cadet from Earth, designation still unstable in early records, did not conform to any known behavioral expectation. At first, we labeled this as unpredictability, then instability, then risk factor escalation. All of those labels were technically correct, and all of them were incomplete, because none of them accounted for what came after. What happens when a being continues to act despite every logical reason to stop? The turning point, as the records now state, occurred during the catastrophic simulation incident, but that phrasing reduces it to data. What it truly was revelation. The human did not simply survive the scenario, she redefined participation within it. That distinction matters, because survival alone is passive, but what she demonstrated was not passivity, it was agency under collapse conditions. That concept still generates disagreement in the Council of Cognitive Sciences. Some argue it is an emergent evolutionary artifact of high-risk planetary environments. Others argue it is cultural reinforcement. And a minority, one that is growing uncomfortably quickly, argues something more unsettling, that it may simply be choice, not encoded, not optimized, not guaranteed, just chosen, repeatedly, across impossible conditions. The Academy has since implemented revised observation protocols for all Earth origin cadets. None of them have behaved identically. That fact alone complicates classification further, because even within their own species, there is no single predictive model. And yet, there is a pattern. It is subtle, but undeniable. When systems fail, when outcomes degrade beyond acceptable survival thresholds, when probability curves collapse into irrelevance, human cadets do not withdraw. They advance. This has been recorded across multiple simulations now, controlled environments, real-time crisis projections, psychological stress constructs. Each time, variation exists in method, but not in direction. Forward. Always forward. It is difficult for us to describe what this means in analytical terms, because our frameworks assume optimization toward survival. Humans appear to optimize toward continuation, even when survival is uncertain, even when pain is guaranteed, even when the outcome cannot be predicted. One analyst summarized it bluntly during a council review. They behave as though stopping is not a valid state. The statement was initially rejected as poetic rather than scientific. It was later reinstated as hypothesis. I now believe it may be closer to truth than we are comfortable admitting, because it reframes everything, not as a rationality, but as priority inversion. Not survival above all else, but meaning within survival. We attempted to correct for this in later simulation cycles. We introduced variables designed to isolate motivation thresholds. We increased severity. We reduced probability of success to near zero margins. We observed for deviation. There was none. The human cadet consistently demonstrated the same response pattern: assess, adapt, act. Even when assessment indicated futility,
even when adaptation required sacrifice, even when action carried no guarantee of result. This is where our systems began to fail, because they rely on predictive cessation points. Humans do not provide them reliably. The result was a cascade of reclassification attempts, each one more complex than the last, each one less successful. Eventually, classification was no longer the goal. Understanding was, and that shift changed everything. Because understanding requires acceptance of ambiguity, and ambiguity in our culture is often treated as failure. But humans exist within it as a baseline condition. That realization has altered academy curricula permanently. First-year cadets are now required to study Earth-origin behavioral models under uncontrolled variability conditions. The syllabus includes a single recurring question: what do you do when certainty is unavailable? Most species answer with risk mitigation strategies. Humans, according to records, do not frame the question in that way. They ask instead, what needs to be done anyway? That difference is not semantic, it is structural. It changes the architecture of decision-making itself. The human cadet, now formally recognized in records as the primary catalyst for this paradigm shift, remained at the academy for several cycles after the incident. She did not present herself as a symbol. She actively resisted that designation. When asked about her actions during the simulation, she responded simply, "I just did what anyone would have." This statement caused further debate than any of her actual behavior, because empirical observation confirmed no other cadet did, not even remotely. When presented with this contradiction, she offered no correction, only a shrug. This too was noted. Over time, however, resistance to interpretation softened, not because answers were found, but because patterns accumulated. Enough repetitions of the same impossible behavior eventually forced a reconsideration of the definition of impossible. The Academy archives now contain a formal entry under revised classification guidelines. Human Behavioral Principle 7A, Persistence under Systemic Collapse Conditions. It is annotated with a cautionary note. Do not assume termination of action under logical failure conditions. There is no consensus on how to apply this principle, but it exists. That alone is significant. The final recorded address by the human cadet was delivered during an interspecies symposium held at the Academy's Central Hall. Attendance exceeded all projections, not because of mandate, but because of interest. Curiosity had replaced apprehension in most participants by that stage, or perhaps something more fragile than curiosity, something closer to admiration. When she spoke, there was no ceremony, no attempt at grandeur. She simply stood at the center of the hall, much like during her first evaluation cycle, and addressed a chamber that once categorized her species as a threat class. Her words were few, but they have been recorded in full across every major archive network. We're not special because we survive. A pause. We're special because we don't stop. There was silence afterward. Not the silence of uncertainty, not the silence of fear, but something unfamiliar to most attending species. A silence that did not seek resolution, only acknowledgement. After the symposium, she departed Academy oversight voluntarily. Her trajectory beyond that point is unmonitored by official record. Some systems flag this as a loss of critical observation data. Others classify it as irrelevance. A minority classification, one that I find myself increasingly aligned with, labels it differently: natural continuation of the observed principle. What remains is the impact, the shift in how we define resilience, the adjustment of survival models, the permanent instability introduced into our assumptions about sentient behavior. Humans, we now understand, are not anomalies to be corrected. They are variables that redefine the equation. We no longer ask whether they will survive under pressure scenarios. That question has been rendered obsolete. We ask instead, what will they choose to do while survival is still uncertain? Because that is where they live, not at the end point, but in the motion towards it. The final archival recording of the original evaluation chamber remains unchanged. Same walls, same lighting, same silence. But those who now enter it report a different sensation. Not dread, not analysis paralysis, not anticipation of failure. Something else entirely.